welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. As the government stares into a deepening revenue black hole, the Prime Minister is prepared to do the previously unthinkable to try to help fill it. What the government has previously ruled out, she says, is back on the table. And the list of possibilities is a long one. The only option the Prime Minister is ruling out is a hike to the GST. Joining me to discuss the day, a Labor MP, Andrew Leigh, and hopefully we'll try and make contact with Liberal frontbencher Sophie Mirabella. We'll have to overcome some technical problems first. We'll hear first, though, from the Prime Minister and the Shadow Treasurer.
The amount of tax revenue the government has collected so far this financial year is already $7.5 billion less than was forecast last October. I have expressly determined we need to have every reasonable option on the table to meet the needs of the times, even options previously taken off the table.
They are bullet words from a Prime Minister. All options are on the table. So increased taxes on superannuation, increased taxes on the family home, death duties which Wayne Swan ruled out in Parliament.
Will you rule out any tax increases under a coalition government?
We're not in the business of ruling things in or out because we don't know what we're going to inherit.
Before we discuss the Prime Minister's announcement, the revenue downgrade is now out to $12 billion this year. We'll listen to her analogy, likening the federal government's budget circumstances to John, a wage earner no longer getting regular bonuses and advised by his employer an expected wage increase is now some years off. Does he slash spending? The Prime Minister says no.
What is John's rational reaction? To respond to this temporary loss of income by selling his home and car, dropping his private health insurance, replacing every second evening meal with 2-minute noodles? Well, of course not. A rational response would be to make some responsible savings, to engage in some moderate borrowing, to get through to the time of higher income with his family and lifestyle intact, and then to use the higher income to pay off the extra borrowing undertaken in the lean years.
Andrew Leigh, what financial counsellor in the world would advise John that maintaining his lifestyle and going into debt to fund it is the sensible thing to do?
Well, Lyndall, what the Prime Minister is referring to here is a challenge that John is facing in having a short-term reduction of his income. And that's exactly the same situation that Australia is in. Australia has seen big decreases in tax revenue. We now have tax revenue down 22% of GDP compared to the 24% of GDP that it was at under the Howard government.
And that's partly because your government has cut sources of revenue, has cut income tax.
Well, mostly, Lyndall, this is because of shocks that have hit the Australian economy, particularly in terms of the high exchange rate, which is a benefit if you're travelling to Bali, but it's a real challenge if you're collecting corporate profits.
Now, what the Prime Minister said today is, in fact, the federal government won't do what necessarily John would do. It's not relying on maxing out its credit card, but spending cuts and revenue rises are in things that have previously been ruled out, and that's quite a long list, isn't it, of things, of possibilities that are open to you. A levy for the NDIS, changing the mining tax, hiking income tax, removing the freeze on petrol indexation. They're all things that have been ruled out before. Potentially they're all on the table now, aren't they?
Well, Lyndall, it's important to recognise the challenge for what it is. The Australian economy has enjoyed strong growth. We've gone from being the 15th largest economy in the world in 2007 to the 12th largest economy now. But because of this quite unusual situation, we've seen a big hit to revenues. It's
and you're
true.
Prepared to think the unthinkable to try and help offset some of the new spending, aren't you?
Well, it's important in those circumstances to find responsible savings measures. We've found around $100 billion of savings over the last 5 budgets, savings that have not always been politically popular, such as means testing the private health insurance rebate. We'll continue to look for those responsible savings measures. But when you hear people saying, well, the total number of dollars of revenue now has gone up, they're missing the fact that as a share of the economy, revenues are well down.
Sophie Mirabella, hopefully we've overcome our technical problems and welcome to the program. If the Coalition wins in September, this is a situation you'll have to deal with too. Joe Hockey today wasn't ruling out tax increases, so now we have from both sides of politics the potential of tax rises, don't we?
Well, the Coalition's always been voted in to fix Labor's mess. It wouldn't be the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last time. What we have seen today is a limp folksy analogy to hide the fact that the Prime Minister is addicted to spending. Revenue actually went up this year. It's gone up $25 billion. It's gone up over 7%. The government can't control itself. Miss Gillard can't control herself. And the problem is we still need to wait for the actual financial figures, for the actual fiscal position, because we can't believe any figures the government gives us. Why? Because every single budget prediction they have given has been wrong, way out of line. They said last year there'd be a deficit of $23 billion. It ended up being $43 billion. So we really do need to see what mess they are leaving to future generations in order for us to assess our full and complete policy response.
You say revenue has gone up by $25 billion. Does that give you room enough to do all the things you're still promising to do, which includes income tax cuts, which includes pension rises, and which includes infrastructure spending?
Lyndall, the promises we make, we will fully fund because we always have. And we will not make outrageous promises, promising industries, the earth, the moon and the stars, only to do what the Prime Minister has done, to backtrack and to break promises, like 600 times promising there would be a budget surplus this year. We will need to be responsible, and what we do need to wait and see is what the actual budget bottom line is, because it's impossible in a vacuum to make these to make final decisions, because we don't know what the state of the books are, and any responsible approach would be to see how much more this government has damaged the budget bottom line, and then to craft an appropriate response, because Australians are very concerned. Confidence is low.
Is the Coalition in fact beginning to wind back promises? We've already seen a winding back on the promise of delivering surpluses in each year of a first term. Tony Abbott's now not putting numbers on his proposed company tax cuts. Is there the possibility that more of the things that you have already promised will be wound back before election day, and you'll in fact go to the election promising very little?
Well, what you can be sure of is that what we do promise at the election is something that we will deliver. We do need to provide confidence back into the National Parliament. The Australian public, industry, business is looking to us to do that, because at the moment our nation's credit rating is seriously at risk, and we know that in the past the Labor Party, under Labor, our credit rating was devalued in 1986 and 1989, and it was the Coalition that won that back. We know that the only way for our nation to progress, for families to have a better standard of living, for job security, is for the government to stop waste, to manage the budget, to provide the right decisions, to give business the confidence to invest. Now we have a Prime Minister saying everything is on the table.
Andrew, is it the fact that if you kept to the budget forecasts in the 2009 budget, a deficit for this financial year at $28 billion, you'd likely be bringing down a deficit smaller than that, and what has tripped the government up is a political promise to bring in a surplus 3 years ahead of plan?
Well, Lyndall, what we're seeing at the moment is substantial decreases in revenue.
That's been happening for a number of years, hasn't it? And even the Treasury Secretary, Martin Parkinson, warned last year that Commonwealth governments would be facing revenue downgrades, would be getting about $20 billion less revenue each year.
Well, one of the charts, Lyndall, that the Prime Minister showed today was the steady increase in these downgrades, which have been driven, it's got to be understood, by some unusual political circumstances. economic circumstances. Part of that is what's going on is that we've seen a slight fall-off in commodity prices, which has reduced company profits in the mining sector.
They were never going to stay as high as they were forever,
well,
weren't they?
That's... Who knows with commodity prices? Notoriously hard to forecast. But normally the effect of that would be to bring down the Australian dollar. What we've seen, though, is an increase in appetite for Australian government bonds. There's now 30 countries in the world holding Australian government bonds, and a demand for Australian government bonds has actually acted to keep up the exchange rate. It's an unusual configuration of events, but it's meant that company profits are down. That's a challenge for us. It would also, of course, be a challenge for the coalition, who, to take one example, say that they'll fund their extremely expensive and regressive parental leave scheme through a company tax levy. The more company taxes go down, the more difficult it is to believe that that promise can be kept. So this is a challenge for all serious economic policymakers, and the Prime Minister today has laid out the scale of that challenge, and it's important to have a national conversation about that, free of sort of sloganeering.
Sophie, is this a part of a conversation that the coalition didn't necessarily want to have, that spending cuts and revenue rises will be needed to fix the structure of the budget?
It's not just a conversation, it's an absolute barbecue stopper. The way this nation's finances have gone into deficit, four of the biggest deficits this country has ever seen. Is it concerning people? Of course it is. Is it an urgent problem? Yes, it is, which is why so many people out there in the community who voted all sorts of ways in the past are crying out for an election sooner rather than later. We see the government blaming all sorts of things for the fact that they can't control their spending. But let's look at what they said in My EFO in October last year. Commodity prices have actually risen above expectation. This government can blame all sorts of things. The problem lies in the fact that they have spent and committed money that they don't have and that they couldn't guarantee, and any basic first-year economics student could have advised them otherwise.
Joe Hockey gave advice today to the Prime Minister's mythical John that he shouldn't increase his credit card limit again. Would the coalition knock back any proposal from the government to lift the debt limit should it come?
Well, we'll just wait and see what the government asks us to do, but I would expect neither John nor Jill would be taking any budgetary advice from this Prime Minister and this government.
Andrew, just to finish up, it is the case, isn't it, that whatever you do in the budget won't fill the structural hole in the deficit? You're just proposing to fund new spending through changes, aren't you?
Well, Lyndall, ever since the global financial crisis, where we acted quickly to fill a substantial gap in private sector demand, we've offset every new revenue measure with an appropriate save. They haven't been easy. When we means tested the baby bonus, Joe Hockey compared it to China's one-child policy. So we'll continue to make those responsible saves. We'll continue to look for sensible sources of tax revenue. But we need to recognise the context in which we're operating and the challenging global circumstances.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Andrew, Leigh and Sophie Mirabella, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndall. Thanks, Sophie.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us at the same time tomorrow. Good night.